I'm Adri. This is Imperfectioknits, and this right here, right now, is an introduction to the channel and to me. Why did something about that intro feel so 2014? I'm once again recording on my lunch break, but we have upped the camera game. I'm using my iPhone, and my MacBook is right over there, so I can still see myself. But if I'm looking that way, it means I'm looking at myself and not you, so I'm gonna try to look this way. But it's hard to look away when I'm that cute. Anyway, before I get drowned in the lake of my own vanity, I am Adri. I'm 27. I live in Boston, specifically the Brighton neighborhood, which is important just because I feel like the neighborhood doesn't get enough love. It's a good neighborhood. I have an English degree from UMass, but I also have minors in math and computer science. And before I went to UMass, I actually went to a more selective school, which is important as we get more into what this channel is about. I work in scientific publication, and I work from home 4 days a week, which is why I can record this on my lunch break. In terms of my knitting, crafting history, I kind of was raised on crafts. It was our standard weekend activity to go window shop at AC Moore, Michaels, and Joann's. And window shopping in the loosest sense of the term, because there was definitely some purchasing that happened. We had this old antique dining table that was just constantly covered in acrylic paint from us crafting, from my grandmother painting, from my dad painting his little miniatures for D&D. The chaos was multiplied like a millionfold in the couple of months before Christmas, when the whole dining room would become a non-stop Christmas decoration ornament factory. My aunt also ran an after-school activity program, so we were just constantly enrolled in miscellaneous art classes at the program. I remember we took one that was a puppet making class. We took one that was bead making with Sculpey clay. But I didn't actually first learn knitting until I was 12. My grandmother tried to teach us all, me, my sister, and cousin, at some point when we were a little younger, but my grandmother was left-handed, and so it was not a very successful attempt. I also think we were just not quite old enough to conceptualize knitting, especially learning it the opposite way. But I remember my cousin learned in some kind of 4th grade knitting club that I was very jealous of. So I was very excited when I finally learned in 7th grade. My best friend had gotten really into knitting, and so I remember we went to the Peabody Essex Museum, which, great museum, and she was in that new to knitting, fully hyperfixation, only thing she wants to do kind of mode. And so while we were at the museum, anytime we were sitting down, she'd take out her knitting and do a couple of rows, and I would sit down with her and watch her knit. And that kind of just watching for probably a few hours, I started to really understand the motion. And so then later that day, or a couple days later, she taught me how, and I got started. I remember I knitted a couple of garter stitch scarves and bulky yarn as gifts that Christmas, and then basically never bothered to learn anything other than garter stitch for years. I would just kind of knit garter stitch scarves, or not even finish the scarves, just knit garter stitch panels for fun throughout high school. At the time, I did like the action of knitting, but I think I also really liked the idea of being someone who knits. If you've ever seen the jokes about people knitting performatively, that was me. I'd be in my high school classes knitting, just hoping to get a rise out of someone. But then I got into the elite college that I mentioned earlier, and there was just no time for knitting. It was so nightmarishly hard that it was just kind of not fail was the goal. But after flaming out the first of several times, I was home for a few months, and I picked up sewing with all the craft supplies we just had laying around from my grandmother and our miscellaneous Joann's, AC Moore, and Michael's trips. And then over the next few years and into the pandemic, sewing just kind of became the thing that I did. And I think even then I was kind of beginning to embrace the philosophy that I use now with knitting, which was this idea of the beauty of creating something even if it's imperfect, and maybe because it's imperfect. I was not a great precise sewer. I didn't iron stuff. I didn't follow patterns. I was just kind of making things up as I went along. And I loved the things that I made, and I wore the things that I made, and I got complimented on the things I made, and there were a lot of mistakes. And I think especially after being that high school overachiever to the level that you could get into an elite college, and then constantly struggling and flaming out and trying to get back in and flaming out again at an elite college, it was really nice and almost empowering to be able to do something imperfectly without consequences. Either the perceived made up consequences that I put on myself in high school, or the very real consequences of failing out of college. And so pandemic happened. I did a semester from home online and kind of realized that I missed home. I was looking at my class schedule for the future semesters, and I was like, there's just literally no way that I'm capable of passing these classes. And also, I don't even think I'm passionate about any of this stuff anyway. I think I was just trying to be passionate about this stuff because it's what you're supposed to be passionate about it when you're good at it. But actually, I wasn't actually enjoying any of the stuff. I just had previously enjoyed being good at it. And so I transferred to UMass, and still took 2 more years before I realized that computer science major was not the major for me, and I switched to the English major. And after 7 grueling years of college, it turns out that if you're studying something that you don't hate, it's actually pretty quick, and I did the whole English major in 1 year. And so in that time, when I had first gotten started at UMass, it was still peak pandemic. People say lockdown, but we didn't really have a lockdown in the US. We just kind of had a, it would be better if you don't go outside. But in that peak of the pandemic, I started crocheting. I just kind of figured it was time. My mom had always crocheted. She made me this blanket. I tried to learn how to crochet once in 8th grade. One of my 8th grade teachers, actually my English teacher, on a day when most of the class, I guess, was on a like week-long long field trip to Washington, D.C. I'd stayed back and a couple other people had stayed back. And so the English teacher taught us how to make these like beaded bracelets with crochet, where you kind of like chain a bead up and then you like crunch them together. It was very, like, I still like the look of them. It was just like a little cluster of beads. It was very cute. But then I was like, okay, so I know how to do a chain now. I learned the basics, and then I tried to actually crochet and I couldn't do it. There was no way of explaining this without it sounding like an innuendo, but I just never knew what hole to go in. But I had slightly more crafting understanding from all my sewing, and I didn't have much else to do because it was the peak of the pandemic, and so I finally put on some tutorials and learned how to crochet. And so when you're on the crafty side of the internet and it's the end of 2020, there's only one place that's going to bring you, and that's the Harry Styles cardigan. I decided to make it, and so I looked up the pattern, and it turns out that the pattern was knitting. And I'm a little too autistic to see that the pattern is knitting and then decide to crochet it anyway. And so I figured it was a good time to try and level up my knitting. I still was kind of, at some point in my high school years, I eventually learned the purl stitch, and that was all I knew, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. So I figured it was a good way to level up my knitting, but I was still a little too nervous to do the whole thing. So I did it in individual panels, even though the pattern is actually written to do it in columns. And I crocheted, instead of doing the houndstooth, I crocheted little granny squares. And then once I'd seamed everything together, I crocheted all the borders. I would actually love to remake it, but like actually following the pattern to the T this time. But the first time I made it, I actually found the yarn just kind of in a thrift store. It was in the Goodwill in Hadley, if you've ever been there, in Hadley, Massachusetts. I just found all the yarn and made the cardigan out of this. It was $12 of yarn. And so I keep waiting to serendipitously discover yarn so I can remake it. But that did really level up my knitting skills. I really learned how to do stitch patterns, learned some decreases, and learned to read my knitting so that I didn't have to be constantly memorizing which row of the pattern I was on. And from there, both knitting and crocheting kind of became like part of my rotation of hobbies. I have autism and ADHD, and the way that the like special interests and hyperfixations merge is not something that really exists with either independently. And so instead of just like having a hyperfixation that I completely drop and never go back to, I kind of cycle special interests. So like I'll hyperfixate on one special interest for a little while, then it'll go into the back burner, and I'll hyperfixate on a new one, and it always comes back around. And so knitting and crochet just kind of got added to the rotation. And then post-college, I guess I was just kind of like itching to learn again, and so I decided it was really time to start intentionally leveling up my knitting skills. And so I started to take on projects that like seemed a little more complicated. I made a cabled scarf for a roommate for Christmas. I cast on my first sweater. It was a very basic like 2 rectangles that I picked up for the sleeves, because the intention wasn't necessarily to learn how to make a sweater as much as it was to prove to myself that I was capable of sticking with a longer project. And it took me, I think, a little over a year, but once I was done with that, I was fully in it. And so a few months ago, I got back into the knitting and crochet phase of my hyperfixations. I started making a couple of dice bags, and I crocheted a skirt, and then I crocheted a top, and then I started to really dive into knitting to an extent that I haven't before. I made my first sweater from an actual pattern, which was the flax worsted pattern by Tin Can Knits. And then I started knitting my first socks in August, and I haven't looked back. I started doing color work, both stranded and in tarsia. I'm doing my first test knit right now. I started like obsessively watching like knitting podcasts and project vlogs and Whip Wednesdays. And one thing I noticed in all of that, which is now we're getting to the channel and not just me, one thing I noticed in all of that is how perfectionistic knitters are. Like, I'd watched a lot of crochet content before, and crocheters are very like go with the flow, chill, do whatever. Knitters are like, if I drop one stitch, I have to frog the whole project and drop this hobby and never show my face again. But as a former perfectionist who has had to learn repeatedly the hard way the consequences of putting that much pressure on yourself, an impossible amount of pressure because perfection is literally impossible, I just wasn't super like vibing with that part of the community. And so after making a few too many TikToks on my just like general main channel talking about knitting, I was like, I should probably have a focused place to talk about knitting. And in that, I really want to publicly and upfront embrace imperfection. The things that you make with your hands are going to be flawed because you're not perfect, you're not a machine, and that's a beautiful thing. And it's okay to have hobbies that you're kind of bad at. In fact, I think it's essential. I think that if you don't have hobbies that you're bad at, you're never going to learn the lesson that I had to learn, again, multiple times the hard way, that being good at something is not the same as liking something. I like ballet. I'm terrible at ballet, but I like ballet. I like knitting. I'm pretty okay at knitting, but I'm not like a master knitter. And on the other hand, I'm like pretty naturally good at math. And I think there's some really beautiful, interesting things philosophically about math, but I don't love math. I just loved being good at math. However, as I mentioned before, one of the reasons I got back into knitting after college was because I wanted to learn. And so I think that there's a really fine line between chasing actual perfection and not feeling good unless you've hit that, and constantly seeking improvement in the direction of perfection with the recognition that perfection is an asymptote and the steps along the way are worthy and beautiful as well. And so this idea of like imperfectionists, which I guess I didn't say yet, but it's a pun. It's, you know, perfectionist, imperfectionist, because knitting. It's not about constantly making the same mistakes and with no care about improving them. There's advice I've heard. I think I had a bit of a hyperfixation on fitness for a while, and there was an advice that I heard a lot when listening to content about that, with this idea of like fail faster, which is like you act and then you fail and then you learn. But if you just spend all your time trying to do it perfectly the first time, you're actually going to be improving less. You only get better by trying and making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And I think that embracing imperfection is kind of in that spirit. So welcome to Imperfectioknits, where we learn and create and we embrace all the steps of the process that take us toward improvement. And most of all, a place where we have fun, because ultimately, this is a hobby. We're doing this for fun. I hope maybe you'll come along with me and make some beautiful mistakes. Was that too cheesy? I'm gonna embrace the genuine, wholehearted, embarrassing truth of that. Come make beautiful mistakes with me.